He expected a plain bride, but the beauty who arrived made him fear his own desire. The letter had arrived in the chill of early spring, when the land was still raw from winter and the fields waited for the slow hand of labor to coax them back to life. He had read it in the dim light of his lamp, the words etched with neat, precise strokes, the kind of handwriting that spoke of discipline rather than passion. It promised him a bride, a woman described not in poetry but in careful plainness. She was steady, it said, not beautiful, not charming, not someone who would stir envy or admiration, but reliable, modest, accustomed to work, capable of enduring a life far from the indulgence of towns. He had folded that letter slowly, letting its weight sink into him. A plain wife was what he needed, not what the world would call a prize but what a man of lonely fields and long winters might call salvation. Beauty, he told himself, was a dangerous gift. He had seen what beauty did to men, how it turned them reckless, how it left them broken when it slipped away. Beauty was not meant to be kept, it was meant to be admired from afar and then forgotten. He had no wish for it. He needed someone who would stay, who would not burn him with longing but who would anchor him to the earth he worked. So he agreed. The arrangements were made. He prepared the room, set aside a corner of the wardrobe, built a small shelf with his own hands. He told himself that he would welcome her as one welcomes rain after drought, not with fire in the blood but with steady gratitude. The day she arrived, the town gathered. The carriage came rattling over the rough road, its wheels throwing dust into the wind. He stood waiting at the edge of the square, boots planted firm, reins held in hands that felt uncharacteristically damp. He kept his eyes low, prepared for the sight of a woman plain and quiet, ready to extend kindness without expectation of attraction. But when the door opened and she stepped down, the world itself seemed to stop breathing. She did not descend with the awkward shuffle of someone unaccustomed to attention. She moved with grace, though not the deliberate grace of vanity. It was the unthinking grace of someone who carried strength in her bones. Her face lifted to the light, her eyes steady, and the crowd that had gathered fell into murmurs sharp with surprise. Sunlight caught in her hair, turning it into threads of gold and brown that shimmered with every step. Her features were not the kind one forgets. They were carved with a quiet majesty, the kind that grows stronger the longer one dares to look. He felt the weight of her presence strike him in the chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. This was not plainness. This was beauty so unadorned and undeniable that it unsettled him more than any painted woman ever had. He looked away sharply, jaw tightening. The letter had lied to him, or else someone had lied in writing it. He had been promised a companion who would not ignite the fire he dreaded, but here was a woman whose very existence threatened to tear down the defenses he had built within himself. He stepped forward, almost too quickly, to take her trunk. His hands brushed the leather, careful not to touch hers, though the nearness of her fingers sent a jolt through him. She lifted her gaze to him then, and he found himself caught in it. Her eyes were not coy, not searching, but steady, eyes that had seen hardship and chosen not to flinch from it. She smiled faintly, a smile that carried no artifice, only quiet acknowledgement, and it shook him more than if she had offered laughter. The townsfolk watched with curiosity, whispering behind hands as he helped her into the wagon. He heard none of it. His mind was a storm, though his face remained stern, his movements brusque. He guided the horse away from the square, the wagon rattling along the road, her trunk settled beside them. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her gaze turned outward toward the horizon. The silence between them was thick, not hostile but charged with something unspoken. He wanted to speak, about the land, about the work, about the home that waited, but his throat tightened with every attempt. He feared what his voice might betray, so he held it back. She did not press. She seemed content to watch the rolling fields, the rough fences, the distant line of trees. Now and then the wind caught a strand of her hair, lifting it across her cheek, and he found his hands clenching tighter on the reins. When they reached the farm, he helped her down, careful to avoid lingering near her. The house stood plain and solid, weathered by years but steady against the wind. He led her inside, pointing out the hearth, the table, the small room prepared for her. His words were short, clipped, his tone almost cold. Yet inside he was restless, his chest tight, his thoughts scattered like loose grain. She nodded with quiet grace, thanking him softly. Her voice was low, warm, carrying a steadiness that lingered even after she closed the door to her room. He stood in the hallway a long moment, listening to the silence that followed, his fists tightening and loosening as though he were fighting something inside himself. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm neither of them spoke of but both accepted. She worked beside him without complaint. She fetched water, carried wood, cooked with simple ingredients that she turned into meals that filled the house with warmth. She did not flinch from labor, her hands becoming calloused, her skin bronzed by the sun. Yet she carried herself with the same grace she had the day she arrived, unshaken by the roughness of life. And he watched. He tried to bury his gaze in the soil, in the fences, in the cattle. But again and again, his eyes betrayed him. They lingered when she bent to gather kindling, when her laughter rose at some small thing, when her hair slipped from its braid to tumble across her shoulders. Each moment was a quiet torture, a reminder of the fire he had sworn to extinguish in his heart. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The creaks of the house carried her presence to him, the soft closing of her door, the faint hum she sometimes made as she folded her clothes, the gentle steps in the hall. Each sound was enough to set his chest aching with longing. He clenched his fists in the dark, fighting the storm inside him, telling himself again and again that she deserved respect, not the hunger that gnawed at him. Yet the hunger did not lessen. It grew with every sunrise, with every moment they spent together in the vast silence of the land. One evening, a storm broke over the valley. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled against the shutters, and the two of them found themselves by the fire, the glow of flames softening the edges of the room. She sat with her dress damp at the hem, her hair curling where the moisture had touched it. She began to speak, not idly, but with depth. She told him of her journey, of the family she had left behind, of brothers and sisters who would never see her again. She spoke of dreams she had carried since girlhood, dreams she had been forced to bury when hardship claimed them. Yet her words were not bitter. They were steady, filled with resilience, like the low murmur of a river that refuses to dry even under drought. He listened, his chest tightening with every word. He wanted to reach for her hand, to close the distance, to tell her that she was not alone. But his hand stayed clenched on his knees, his body rigid with restraint. His heart pounded with the longing to bridge the space, but his fear held him fast. When her eyes lifted to his, the firelight reflected in them, he saw not temptation but trust. She was not trying to seduce him, not trying to unravel him. She was simply offering herself in honesty, and that honesty shook him more than beauty ever could. He turned his gaze away, swallowing hard, the shame of his silence pressing against him. That night he did not sleep. He paced the halls, his footsteps echoing against the wood. He was a man hunted, not by wolves, not by enemies, but by his own heart. The days that followed only deepened his struggle. Her patience, her kindness, her quiet strength, they pressed against the walls he had built inside himself. She never mocked his stiffness, never questioned the distance he kept, but she saw it. He could feel her sensing the battle he fought, though she did not force him to speak of it. Then came the morning that changed everything. The sky was pale with dawn, the fields bathed in gold. She stood in the open land, her face lifted to the rising sun, her figure still and radiant as though she belonged to the light itself. He stopped in his tracks, unable to breathe. In that moment, something inside him gave way. He walked toward her, each step heavy with surrender. She turned, her eyes widening as she saw what had shifted in his. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling, and when hers closed around his, steady, warm, unflinching, it was as though the earth itself had shifted beneath him. In that single touch, he understood the truth he had fled from. Beauty was not his enemy. Desire was not a curse. What he feared was love, the raw, consuming power of it. Yet here she stood, her hand in his, and he saw that surrender was not destruction. It was the beginning of something greater than fear. The rest of the day unfolded differently. He worked beside her without hiding his glances, without choking back the small smile that came when she met his eyes. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was alive, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. And when dusk fell, for the first time in years, he felt a peace not born of solitude but of belonging. The days that followed the morning in the field carried a strange new rhythm.
one that neither of them spoke of, yet both moved within as though guided by a hidden current. Their hands had touched, just briefly, yet that single contact had altered the shape of their lives. He rose with the sun, as he always had, but now there was a brightness in the air that no dawn alone could bring. She moved through the house with the same steady grace, yet something unspoken lingered between them, filling the silence with a charge neither could ignore. He worked harder than before, though he did not need to. His muscles strained at the plow, his hands grew rougher on the reins, and when she brought him water in the fields, he looked at her with a quiet hunger he could no longer disguise. She would hold out the tin cup, her fingers brushing his as he took it, and though the gesture was small, it echoed like thunder through the hollow places in his chest. Her eyes would meet his for just a heartbeat too long, and then she would turn back toward the house, her skirt brushing the grass, leaving him restless under the weight of desire he had spent years trying to bury. At night, the house no longer felt like a cage. It was alive with her presence, every corner touched by her laughter, every room warmed by her voice. Sometimes she would hum as she worked, and he would stop in the doorway, listening silently as though she were casting a spell. He wanted to speak then, to tell her what burned in him, but the words felt too fragile, too heavy with meaning. Instead, he carried them like stones in his chest, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Yet fear still lingered. The memory of beauty lost, of desire turned to ashes, haunted him like a shadow. He had built his life on control, on distance, and though his heart now longed to leap, his mind still trembled at the thought of falling. He wondered if she sensed it, if she knew how often he woke in the night, torn between the urge to knock on her door and the iron command of restraint. The town had begun to notice. When they went together to the market, whispers followed them. Men looked at her with hunger, women with envy, and he felt the heat of their gazes burn against his back. He clenched his fists but said nothing, though every stare at her felt like a theft of something that belonged to no one but her and him. She walked with dignity, her head high, her hand steady as she selected grain or fabric, as though she were untouched by the murmur of voices. Yet he saw the flicker in her eyes, the knowledge that she was no longer invisible, that her beauty had made her both admired and envied. One evening, as they returned from town, the wagon creaked beneath them, the road long and silent. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in fire. He held the reins tight, his jaw clenched, but finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. "They look at you." She turned her head, her expression unreadable. "People always look," she said softly, her tone neither proud nor bitter, but matter of fact. He swallowed hard, the words tearing at his throat. It makes me want to strike them down." For a long moment, she was silent. Then she reached out, her hand brushing lightly against his arm, just enough to steady him, just enough to remind him that she was beside him. "Let them look," she whispered. "What matters is where I choose to stay." Her words sank into him, deeper than any sermon or scripture could. He turned his gaze toward her then, and in her eyes he saw no fear, no hesitation, only truth. He did not answer, but his grip on the reins eased, his shoulders loosening as though she had untied a knot within him. As the days bled into weeks, the boundary between them grew thinner, stretched. Taut with every stolen glance, every brush of hands, every silence that begged to be broken. She was patient, but not passive. She carried herself with quiet certainty, as though she knew that time itself would deliver him into her arms when he was ready. He admired that patience, though it tormented him. Then came the harvest, long days of sweat and toil, the fields demanding everything of them. She worked beside him, lifting, carrying, gathering, her dress damp with sweat, her skin bronzed under the sun. He tried not to watch, but he could not help himself. Her strength humbled him, her laughter lifted him when exhaustion pressed heavy on his bones. When the harvest was finally done, they stood together in the fields, watching the golden stacks rise like monuments to their labor. He turned to her then, the words hovering on his lips, but before he could speak, thunder rolled in the distance. The storm came fast, sweeping across the land with fury. They ran toward the house, the sky black, rain slashing down like blades. By the time they reached the porch, both were soaked, their clothes clinging, their hair plastered against their skin. She laughed, breathless, the sound wild and unrestrained, and in that moment he could no longer hold back. He reached for her, his hands trembling as they closed around her arms. Her laughter faded, her breath caught, and for a heartbeat they stood frozen, the storm raging around them. Then she lifted her face to him, and he saw no fear, only a fierce, quiet certainty that shattered the last of his restraint. His lips found hers, desperate and trembling, the kiss not of practiced passion but of a man surrendering to everything he had denied. She answered him with equal fire, her hands rising to his shoulders, pulling him closer. The storm roared, but within its fury they found a silence, a stillness, as though the world itself had been waiting for this moment. When at last they broke apart, their foreheads resting together, both breathless, he whispered against her skin, his voice raw. I feared this, feared what I might become. She touched his face, her fingers gentle, her gaze steady. You feared love, she said softly. But love is not your enemy. That night, the house was no longer divided by walls. For the first time, he let himself enter her room, his heart pounding, his body trembling with both fear and desire. Yet what unfolded was not the frenzy he had dreaded, but a slow unwrapping of souls. They touched, they whispered, they trembled together, not as strangers or as captor and captive of passion, but as two who had found in each other the truth they had long denied. Morning found them tangled in quiet, the dawn filtering through the window, their hands still clasped even in sleep. He woke first, watching her breathe, and for the first time in years, he felt no emptiness inside him. Only peace. But peace was not without its trials. The town grew sharper in its whispers, some saying she was too fine for him, others that she would not stay. Men lingered too long when she passed, their eyes hungry, their voices laced with jest. Women judged her in silence, their envy thick as smoke. He heard it all, and it burned him, but she met it with quiet dignity. She walked beside him without wavering, her chin lifted, her eyes calm. One afternoon, a man in town dared too much, stepping too close, his words crude. Before he could think, his fist struck the man's jaw, dropping him to the dirt. The square fell silent, all eyes on him, and shame rose hot in his chest. But when he turned to her, expecting disappointment, she only touched his arm, her eyes steady. You defended what you love, she whispered. There is no shame in that. Her words steadied him more than any crowd's judgment could. From that day on, he no longer hid his devotion. He walked beside her openly, his hands sometimes brushing hers, his gaze unafraid to rest on her. The town still whispered, but he no longer cared. Seasons turned. The farm flourished, the fields giving more than they had in years. The house, once cold and silent, now carried warmth in every corner. She filled it with laughter, with songs, with the soft presence of a woman who belonged. He filled it with strength, with steadiness, with the quiet protection of a man who had finally surrendered to love. They were not without quarrels. There were days when his fear resurfaced, when he withdrew into silence, when the old shadows tried to reclaim him. But she was patient, never demanding, always waiting with that quiet strength that had first disarmed him. And when she faltered, when loneliness for her old home struck, when the weight of the land pressed too heavily on her shoulders, he was there, steady, unyielding, his hands lifting hers, his presence reminding her she was no longer alone. Together they built not just a farm, not just a home, but a life bound by the unshakable truth that desire need not destroy, that beauty need not burn, that love, when faced without fear, was stronger than both. And so the man who had once prayed for plainness, who had once feared the fire of beauty, came to understand that what he had been given was not a curse but a gift. A gift that demanded courage, surrender, and faith. A gift that remade him. Each morning, when the sun rose and she stood again in the fields, her face lifted to the light, he no longer trembled with fear. He only watched, his heart steady, his hand reaching for hers, knowing that in her he had not only found beauty but the very life he had once thought he would never deserve. The night after Eleanor's daring words hung between them like an oath, Thomas found no peace. He paced the wooden floor of his room, hands gripping his hair, heart pounding with a violence he could not master. Then let it burn. Those 4 words ignited something he had kept buried all his life. He feared desire because he had seen it turn men reckless, destroy families, leave only ruin. Yet here was Eleanor, asking not for restraint, but for release, and every part of him wanted to surrender. Sleep never came. At dawn, Thomas went to the fields with a fury, plowing and hauling as though punishing the earth itself. Eleanor watched from the porch, her face unreadable. She did not chase him with words, nor did she shy away. She simply let her presence linger, steady and unshaken, as though telling him that time would not erase what stood between them. That evening, they worked side by side in the barn, stacking hay bales. The silence was unbearable. Thomas lifted one after another, sweat rolling down his arms, every movement charged with the effort to control himself. Then Eleanor slipped. Her foot caught the edge of a beam, and before she could fall, he caught her, his arms closing around her waist. The world stopped. Her body pressed to his, her breath warm against his neck. She clutched his shirt, eyes wide, but she did not pull away. Neither did he. The haze scent, the dust, the quiet rustle of horses, everything blurred until only she remained. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand, resting it against his chest. His heart thundered beneath her palm. Her gaze rose to meet his, steady and fierce. "Thomas," she whispered, "you cannot keep running from what you already feel." His breath shook. "You don't know what I've fought to bury." "I don't want what you've buried," she replied. "I want what is alive." The dam broke. With a sound torn from his soul, Thomas pulled her to him, his lips finding hers with a hunger that had been caged too long. She melted into him, her hands gripping his shoulders as though afraid he might vanish. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, consuming, raw with years of restraint finally undone. He trembled as if struck by lightning, terrified and elated all at once. When they parted, breathless, their foreheads rested together. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice ragged, "if I lose myself, it will be because of you." She smiled faintly, her tears shining in the dim light. "Then I will hold you steady." From that night forward, everything changed. They no longer danced around their longing. It surged openly, woven into every look, every touch. Work became lighter when done together, their laughter spilling across the fields. Yet with their closeness came new fears. Thomas wondered what the world would say, what judgment would fall upon a farmer and his bride who had defied expectation. Eleanor wondered if his desire would fade, if she was only a flame meant to burn quickly and leave ashes. But neither voiced their doubts. Instead, they clung to the present, to the quiet joy of stolen moments. At dusk, Thomas taught her how to guide the plow, his hand covering hers on the reins. At dawn, Eleanor surprised him by preparing bread the way his mother once had, filling the house with a scent he thought lost forever. Their days became a rhythm of work and tenderness, and in that rhythm, love grew roots deeper than either had expected. Yet the world did not remain silent. Word of Eleanor's beauty traveled to town, carried by the trader who had visited weeks earlier. Men whispered, women speculated. Why would such a woman choose a solitary farmer? Some mocked Thomas, others coveted Eleanor. One afternoon, a group of townsfolk arrived uninvited, under the pretense of neighborly curiosity. Their eyes lingered too long, their questions sharp with insinuation. Eleanor bore it with grace, but Thomas burned inside, fighting the urge to drive them all away. That night, he confessed his fear. They will never leave you in peace. They will come, again and again, until they take even the stillness from this land. Eleanor touched his cheek, her thumb brushing the line of his jaw. Let them talk, let them wonder. What they say cannot touch what we have. Her strength steadied him. He realized then that love was not just desire or comfort. It was defiance, the courage to stand against the world together. And yet, he knew the whispers would not stop. Weeks later, as autumn winds began to cool the fields, a letter arrived from Thomas's brother, a man he had not spoken to in years. The words were sharp, questioning his judgment, mocking the choice of a bride so far beyond his station. Men will think you bought what you could never deserve, the letter sneered. Thomas's hands shook as he read, shame and rage collided. He tried to hide it from Eleanor, but she found the crumpled paper in the firewood pile. That evening, she placed it before him on the table. Do you believe these words? She asked quietly. He could not meet her eyes. Sometimes. I do. Her silence cut deeper than the letter itself. She stood, trembling, then said, if you truly believe I am some prize you did not earn, then you do not see me at all. She left the room, her footsteps echoing through the house. For days, a gulf opened between them. They spoke little, and when they did, their voices carried the weight of unspoken pain. Thomas wrestled with himself, torn between his old fears of unworthiness and the truth that Eleanor had chosen him freely. He thought of the moment she had said, then let it burn, and realized she had risked everything, while he still clung to chains of doubt. One night, unable to bear the distance any longer, Thomas went to her room. She sat by the window, moonlight tracing her face, her expression weary but resolute. He knelt before her, his voice raw. I have been a coward. I have let fear blind me. I thought desire would destroy me, but it is doubt that is tearing us apart. Eleanor, I am not worthy, but I do not care anymore. I would rather be unworthy at your side than empty without you. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She cupped his face in her hands, pulling him up to her. Then let us be unworthy together, she whispered. The wall between them crumbled. They embraced, not with the desperation of their first kiss, but with the steadiness of two souls finally choosing each other fully. That night, their union was not born of fear or secrecy. It was born of surrender, of trust, of love that had been forged in silence and storm alike. From then on, their lives were no longer haunted by doubt. The townsfolk still whispered, but Thomas and Eleanor paid them no heed. They worked the land, their love woven into every furrow, every harvest. Winter came, harsh and biting, yet the warmth between them filled the house with light. In the quiet of those cold nights, Thomas often watched her sleeping, marveling that the beauty he had once feared was now his greatest strength. Years later, when neighbors spoke of them, they did not speak of scandal or whispers. They spoke of a farmer and his bride who had built a life on the raw prairie, whose love had endured storms and scorn, and who had found in each other something fierce and unbreakable. Thomas no longer feared his own desire, for in Eleanor's eyes, he had found not his downfall, but his salvation. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now. Watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in the way you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.